Welcome to the first in a brand new series of Groove of the Week videos. Every week I'll be taking a bass groove that I feel deserves wider recognition, transcribing it, and then teaching you how to play it. First off, the band is Ghost Note, the bass player is MonoNeon, and the song is Swagism. It goes something like this. The main groove is built around the classic funk formula of a static one-chord vamp. In this case, we're playing over G sharp minor. It's kind of G sharp minor 6. If you listen out to the guitar voicing on the track, you'll hear the major 6 at the top. You can think of it as A flat minor 6 if you wish. Doesn't really matter, same sound, different enharmonic spellings for the notes. Anyway, that puts us in a sort of Dorian situation, if that's a label that you want to use. I like to think of it as just G sharp minor 6. Anyway, we've got a 4-bar vamp. It goes something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So a pretty straightforward groove, by all accounts. Sits nicely in that classic minor pentatonic position, really, that is one of the first things that we learn as bass players often. So we're starting on the 5th, double chromatic approach into the octave from the flat 7, so 5th, flat 7, chromatic, into the octave. Then we're dropping down octave, 5th, root. And then we've got this little second phrase, which is just 5th, flat 7, octave, and then minor 3rd. I've got a hammer on between that flat 7 and the octave. If you wish, you can play that phrase elsewhere on the neck. Gives you a slightly different sound. Use your ears as a guide, and your bass will tell you where to play the line. So it's up to you which you think sounds better, really. So that's our first phrase. We then have the first part stated again, and then a second variation. Now, there's a little muted note in there, a ghost note, if you will. And it's up to you where you play this. You might want to play it on the same string, or you might want to use a little bit of raking with the right hand and just rake through the A string into the E string, which is my preference. So the whole thing. And that's it, pretty much. So that bass line is a great example of what I call the question and answer style of composition, which is present in a lot of some of the most famous bass lines around. Think about Good Times by Chic, Another One Bites the Dust, Walking on the Moon. All of those bass lines have the same idea in common, where they have a question phrase and then an answer phrase. And that's a really good tactic when you're writing lines for keeping the listener interested. So the second part of Swagism, and this is the bit that really grabbed my attention, is the fairly horrendous unison lick that happens between the solos. It sounds like this. Now, if you haven't done much delving into the dark arts of jazz, that just sounds like a bunch of unrelated random notes strung together. But if you've ever done any work on trying to play bebop heads or solos, Charlie Parker is the guy that springs to mind for this, then you'll start to recognise that sort of vocabulary. When we break it down, that unison line is just really chord tones, scalar approaches, and chromatic approaches. If we break down the line into its component parts, we're really just analysing 3 different chords. The first one, B major 7, the second one is G sharp minor, and then C sharp 7. So, we're starting off with a descending B major arpeggio. So I'm starting on the major 7th with my little finger, playing the major 7 and the 5th on the same string, from the 5th, major 3rd, root, sliding to the major 7. And then we finish off that little phrase by landing on the G sharp. Whole thing. I'm raking with my right hand, just using a single finger to play any consecutive notes on adjacent strings descending. So all of those three are played with one finger rather than trying to alternate. Much easier that way. So I've also got a slide on that B to the A sharp. That helps to put my hands in a new position to get ready for the next part of the line. So from there, we're going to outline a G sharp minor arpeggio. We're going to do that first of all by using a couple of enclosures or approaches, however you want to describe them, which lead into the root note. So I'm going to start a semitone below the root, and then a tone above, and then I'm going to land it on the root. So if I put that on the end of what we just played, the B major thing, I've done another position shift there, because that is going to allow me to access the entire rest of the lick in one position. Horizontal position shifts are a nightmare on the bass, so you want to get them out of the way as soon as possible. That's my philosophy anyway. So if I put those two things together, from there, that's the start of a new part of the phrase. We're ascending through a G sharp minor arpeggio with a couple of scalar approach notes in there. So G sharp, we've got the second or the ninth of the chord, if you want to think of that, leading into the flat 3, into the 4th, 5th, and then flat 7. You'll hear I've got a hammer on in there between the second and the flat 3. It's helping to match the phrasing of the sax in that line. So if I put those two things together, and then with there on the flat 7 of the G sharp minor, the F sharp, from there we're going back to the 5th, and we're using a double chromatic approach into what will become the major third of the C sharp 7. Now, strictly speaking, that note should be called E sharp, but no one likes to think about E sharps. Looks and smells and sounds like F natural. Anyway, and then we're dropping down to the root note. So the bass doesn't play the entire lick that the sax does. You can play the entire lick, and we'll look at that in a second because it involves some different fingerings for the rest of the line. But after that approach, you're down into the root notes of the chord. So, whole thing. And again, towards the end of that, I used hammer-ons instead of picking everything, because I feel it gets me closer to the sound of the line as it's played on the saxophone. It makes it a little bit more musical. I find if we try and pick everything, you end up sounding a bit like a typewriter. Also, it means you can get away with a lot, and you don't have to coordinate your hands as much if you use legato. So there is, of course, another way to play this, using different fingerings for each arpeggio. You should really have two usable fingerings for every single chord type that you know. One starting from this half of the hand, finger 1 or 2, and one starting from the other half of the hand. So initially, we had this idea. So that's a major 7, but starting from my 4th finger. And then we had a minor arpeggio starting from my 4th finger. And then really, we were using this idea for the C sharp 7. If we think about a different way to play a major 7 arpeggio, that's the one that most people are probably most familiar with. So that's the start of our line. If we play the line all in one position, it makes life a lot easier actually. But then, unless you're on a 5 string, you've got to jump a long way to grab that C sharp. I could play it there. I don't really like the sound of that on my instrument. I prefer that one. So, or it's a bit of a mess if you're going to do that jump. If you want to play the whole line that the sax plays, that's it. See if you can grab those notes. There's notation on the blog. Anyway, that last little bit, really good practice for left-hand legato technique. Trying to make all of those notes seamless. Very easy on the G string, pretty difficult on other strings. Difficult to make it sound nice. Something worth practicing, definitely. If you've got a favourite bass groove that you think deserves wider recognition, then why not tell me about it by leaving a comment below here? It might even make it into a future episode.